Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Jeff Harwell. Jeff is a CVA, MAFF, and CMEA with experience in business valuations, merger and acquisitions, corporate turnaround, litigation support, and operational consulting. He holds an MBA from Texas Christian University and a BBA from the University of Texas. Mr. Harwell has been in financial and operational management for over 40 years and has served in the role as President, Chief Financial Officer, and Consultant. As a principal of Harwell & Company, his project work includes business and forensic valuation, fixed asset appraisal, and operational consulting for firms seeking transition support or profit improvement. He's a member of NACVA and has served on its Standards Committee, the State Chapter Committee, and Educational Quality Assurance Board, and Ambassador's Editorial Board and Think Tank. He presently serves as a State Chapter President of North Texas, as a frequent webinar presenter for NACVA, and we are excited to have him here today. So with that, I will turn the time over to Jeff.
Thank you, Colin, and welcome everybody taking this time out of their day to attend this webinar, learning a little bit about personal economic damages and also damages advocate in the forensic practice. So let's kind of get started, and I'll tell you a little more about myself. You already know how to obtain the CPE credit for the webinar. Colin's gone over that. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. And I think the first question I probably would like to tell you after the introduction is, why is this guy giving a webinar on personal economic damages? I'm going to say this later on in the webinar, but I'm what you refer to as a first-generation forensic economist. And what that means is I've been doing this for some time, and the way I got into it as a first-generation forensic economist is I happened to be at the right place at the right time. I've been doing business valuations for a good number of years, actually around 40 years, you can figure it back. And I had a mentor in grad school who suggested or almost begged me to take up personal economic damages. And I had no idea what I was doing. He said, sure you can. And he gave me an outline. He sent me over to visit a personal friend of his on the university that was a PhD and an economist who did forensic analysis. I got some information from him. I purchased a couple of textbooks, used a luggable portable computer, went to the library, downloaded tables, and built my own models, and learned the hard way and got after it and did this actively for at least 3.5 years through trial. But we'll talk about that a little bit further on. But just so you know, we're going to go and look at some objectives today. We're going to learn together, and I do mean learn together as we talk about personal damages, what those opportunities are, what you need to know about them to be successful. And let's go over some of the objectives that we want to achieve today. After this webinar, you should be able to recognize the opportunities and challenges in the field of personal economic damages. And I'm going to point those tips and traps and opportunities for you. We're going to list the resources available to support the personal economic damages calculations. You should get a beginning list through this webinar and have a starting point to lay your foundation, which will be much more than I had in the very beginning. And finally, we're going to explain how damages advocate application could assist you in organizing the information about a plaintiff's economic loss and present the findings in an attorney-friendly format. That's really the second part of the webinar. And finally, we're going to identify how damage advocate provides either a complete economic damage solution or at least a backup, reality check, or supplemental solution in this area and field. Let's start off with the basics this morning. In personal economic damages, as opposed to commercial economic damages, we are measuring and forecasting the output or productivity of an asset. I'm going to keep this in very simple terms, and I think if we keep it in simple terms, we'll best understand it, and you'll be able to remember it. So the second concept is we need to think of people as an asset. People have the ability to generate income for use by themselves and family. People require maintenance, food, shelter, clothing. Think about that list so you have a full understanding of it. And people have an estimated life. They have two estimated lives. One, they have a work life that we need to estimate, and then they have their own life in terms until they reach a date of death or a mortality date. So we need to think about these lives that we have. So those are the basics, fundamentals of determining an economic damage. Those are some of the essentials. We'll talk about those a little bit further. So let's start off with some definitions. Economic damages refer to compensation for objectively verifiable monetary losses, such as past and future earnings, past and future medical expenses, loss of use of property, cost of repair or replacement, the economic value of domestic services, and the loss of employment or business opportunities. We have non-economic damages or hedonic damages. We're not going into that. This is not something that typically a forensic economist or valuation analyst gets into, but think of this as the pain and suffering that an individual might suffer as a result of an injury or even death, no fault of their own. And last but not least are punitive damages, and these are the punishment stages that are added on in certain instances and certain cases. But going back to the economic damages that we think about, we need to start thinking about the monetary losses that we have, past and future earnings. That requires a forecast. We know what we have in terms of current earnings at the date of a loss, but how do we project those out? What about medical expenses if they are incurred? Will those be ongoing medical expenses or are they one-time charges? Was there loss of property as a result of an injury or death? The value of domestic services. Are those going to be the household services that we're talking about, the maintenance cost? These are all things that we need to consider. And as a result, we can put those in a pretty much simple formula. And I'd like you to take a moment to take a look at the formula, because we're going to be concentrating on this in a few minutes as we get further into our presentation today. We've got earnings capacity minus the mitigated earnings. In short, if we have a loss, it's what's that loss had not there been an event. And if there is a loss, what kind of earnings would offset that loss? Minus the personal consumption in a wrongful death case gives us a net earnings loss. We have loss of fringe benefits. I think everybody's pretty much aware of fringe benefits. Social Security, mandated fringe benefits, pensions, profit sharing plans, and the list goes on. We also have loss of production of household services that I alluded to. What does an individual do aside from work that represents production of a non-economic standpoint or perspective. Think of mowing the lawn, taking care of children, doing household chores. That list can go on as well. And we also mentioned the future medical expenses, whether they're a one-time charge or it's an ongoing charge. We sum all those together, we get a total loss, and that's the damage loss. And most of us are very aware, for those in the financial community, then we'll take those losses, which are also forecast out to a future value, and we'll bring those back to present value. And that is really what we're looking at. And that present value is the value of a life or loss. But once you look at the simple formula, that really puts us in a position to fully understand what we're looking at in personal damages. I might also state that we'll see a little later that we really have three types of personal damages that we'll be talking about today. One is personal injury. The second is wrongful death. And the final is employment losses, typically wrongful discharge and those types of actions that are being brought up from an employment. Periodically through this presentation, I'm going to bring up some questions and thoughts for you to be contemplating that might also be considered in the current environment we live in under COVID-19, which might affect some of these decisions that we're going to make in arriving at a damage calculation. What are the details and the data? I like to always say the devil is in the detail. And as forensic financial analyst and forensic economist, this is really where the rubber meets the road. We're trying to determine what's the earnings capacity of an individual. Where do we get that earnings capacity? We've got, when we take in and do our survey of a defendant or the subject of our engagement, we're looking at the earnings of that individual. We are looking at what they did, what their occupation is, and that's their current earnings. What about into the future? How are we going to forecast that earnings capacity into the future? And if there is a loss in a personal injury, what is that earning capacity going to be in a post-loss environment? Will it be as much? Will it be less? How will it be impacted? And what other variables will impact that earnings capacity? The second is the work-life expectancy of an individual. Many years ago, I'm sure that most people would just think the work-life expectancy was the date of retirement. But as we all know, that date of retirement is now changing. We're retiring at 65, or we take an early retirement at 60, or we stretching it out because of Social Security, we're stretching it out to 70. So what is that work-life expectancy? How are we going to determine what that work-life expectancy is? And what variables affect the work-life expectancy of a given individual? Life expectancy. Life expectancy is another, it's something what would seem very simple or simplistic. We go out and look at a mortality table. But sometimes there's a little bit more than that in terms of what the life expectancy of an individual is, besides an individual, their sex, and perhaps even their nationality. We have a lot of opportunities here, but we have to know what that life expectancy is going to be of the individual. Could there be circumstances that would affect that life expectancy of an individual, and how do we account for it? The next is personal consumption. Regardless of an event, of a loss, people are going to continue to consume. There's a certain level of consumption of food, shelter, and clothing costs that would go on with or without the loss. And so we have to consider what that personal consumption might be How do we determine that personal consumption? And what kind of assumptions can we make about it? The next is fringe benefits. What are the fringe benefits that an individual has? Can we look at those benefits as a group, as a percentage of compensation or salary? Can we take them as a whole, as an individual? What data is out there to determine the level of fringe benefits that an individual is going to acquire or be entitled to in a calculation of damages? We also have to consider the household services, which I touched on earlier. What does the individual provide to the household, to the family unit, and that would have a replacement cost? I remember years ago when I first started this, there was very little data about it, but you had to go out and actually look and determine an individual, exactly what did that specific individual do, and how are their hours accounted for a given week, for a given month, for a given year, and apply a value. Where did that value come from? How am I going to assign that value? That made perfect sense, economic sense, that I could relate to a jury, to a trier of fact. So it's a little more complicated than that, but you can think about what you do outside of your work life that has value, that brings value to the family unit, and that has value as an economic value. And the last but not least is rates. As financial analysts, as valuation analysts, as forensic financial analysts and economists, we deal with rates. I'm going to assume that most people know what present value is, how to determine present value. What's that present value rate? Where do you get that rate? There are multiple sources. What source do I want to get that rate? We're going to look at rates, and we're going to talk about rates. Is it before inflation? Is it after inflation? Is it a nominal rate? How should the rate be constructed? Is it before tax or after tax? These are all great questions. And as I said before, working in this area, the devil is in the details. Once you have that, then it's just a matter of looking at how it's going to apply to the data that you have on hand. So now we can really pretty much get into the who, what, and where, and how what you need to know about personal damages. You might ask yourself, who performs all of these calculations? And what's that profile? Well, I wanted to share that with you. Based on the most recent studies, the people that are performing personal economic damages are mostly PhD economists, 58%. 16% of those performing these studies are MBAs, have an MBA. There's a 12% that have some other master's degree. We got 7% that are simply undergraduates in some degree or another. And we have finally another 7% that are made up of CPAs and other professionals in that area. So you can see the vast majority of people that are performing this service are forensic economists and PhDs. What are these people doing? Well, they're doing data modeling. They're taking the data that they have and they're modeling it based upon information they have. And based that data is either known or probable. It's based upon assumptions. This is what one uses to lay out the forecast to determine the economic damages, taking the data and using known or probable statistics and studies and assumptions to determine the economic damage calculation. You might also ask yourself a real quick question, is that, what are these studies? Well, the studies are the assumptions. This is really what one needs to get to know and understand. In valuation arena, we use assumptions and limit conditions all the time, but maybe not to this level of specificity. We know where our databases are. We make certain assumptions about the individuals, and some of it's subjective, some of it's not. But in this case, we have a lot of studies that we need to know about and talk about. Some of these studies, the vast majority early on, were all public studies. And these public studies, where do you find them? Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Center for Disease Control, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Federal Reserve. But just remember that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has lots and lots of studies, as does the Center for Disease Control, which we get the mortality tables that we need to do a calculation. The Bureau of Economic Analysis has a lot of other good data about occupations and rates. And the Federal Reserve, most of it's in valuation, though, that the Federal Reserve has lots of information. We've got risk-free rates from the Federal Reserve. We can go out the Federal Reserve Philadelphia, and we can pull a Livingston study. We can pull a survey of professional forecasters to determine what the future rates might look like. The Federal Reserve has lots of different rates depending upon which one you choose and how you choose it. We use those rates a lot of times to determine historical rates, future rates, tiered rates, and whatnot. It's just the beginning of the public information. Some of the studies are private. Examples of that would be the work-life study and the consumption study. These are studies that are necessary to complete the calculation. And it's not just one work-life study or one consumption study. There are multiple studies. And we need to understand the strengths and limitations of each of those studies. As even the public studies, we need to know the strengths and limitations of those. We need to know which ones to use. So that brings us down to really what comes to a point of, we have decisions, and more decisions to be made about each of these. I might just digress here just for a moment, because we're doing these webinars during COVID-19 to help everyone out. So we take a moment to look at some of these questions we have for those that have attended some webinars and talked about rates. Think about the Federal Reserve, and I think right now in the Federal Reserve, we've got some artificial rates going on to keep rates low during COVID-19. How is the unemployment factors going to affect Bureau of Labor Statistics when we come to look at the year 2019? Is that going to be a major, could that be a major problem or some consideration we're going to give it in calculating future economic damages? We're having some health issues with suicides and depressions and other areas. I'm not sure whether or not that's going to affect the mortality rate, but it well could. Even in the work life and the consumption area, certainly people may be consuming less or consuming more, depending on what you're consuming during COVID-19. Certainly probably not as going out shopping, buying as many clothes, and maybe having expenses going out. But these could all be factors that could affect the year 2020 as we look back in future data sets. But anyway, these are decisions we have to make, and they'll go right into our assumptions. So you ask the question, these resources, where do I get them? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of them are very public, so you can go straight to the government. You can either go to the library, and most of them are available right on the internet. And sometimes you can do internet research. And I'll give you some examples of the government sources. As I said before, I was a first generation forensic economist, financial analyst. You know, at that point in time, literally every table and every resource that I had to get required me to go to the library. I knew the librarians by first name. By whatever study I got, it got to a point where they would pull the books before I got there when I found them. And then I would go back in and I would put those into my model. Today, you know, you can do it right on the internet. You can go right to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can go right to Center for Disease Control. You have that access. On top of that, you can do internet research. A lot of times the studies, whether it be public or whether private, just by picking up your mouse and your internet connection, you can go right and do the internet research. You may be able to find the study and the information that you desire, or information or questions that you have. You may find the answer right through the internet. I think probably more importantly are reference books and sources. And I've underlined the first reference book that I want to point out, and that's Determining Economic Damage. It was Determining Economic Damage, which originally the authors were Gerald Martin and Mark Weinstein. It's a phenomenal work, and I personally believe that anybody that's involving themselves and getting involved or is practicing personal economic damages needs a copy of Determining Economic Damages. The newest editions that have been picked up are by Stanley Stevenson and also David McPherson. It's also a good book. The most recent edition also has some chapters devoted to commercial damages, which is not unusual. These are not the only books, but I've also listed Forensic Economist, Assessing Personal Damages in Civil Litigation by Frank Tenari, and also How Economists Compute Lost Earnings and Other Economic Damages in Personal Injury Cases, also by Stanley Stevenson. I think these are all good books. You probably should have them on your bookshelf. They will be good references. They'll probably give you some of the tables that you're looking for, and other insights into choices and those decisions that I said that you need to be making. It's not going to be just a black and white. It's going to require you to make some decisions and have some understanding, which gets us to the next transition, is what else might I use as a resource? Professional associations. I think these are very key for learning and sources of information for damages. The first one I have listed is the National Association of Forensic Economists, NAFE for short. And I can't say enough about this organization. They have a publication, which is the Journal of Forensic Economics. Many of the studies that our damage calculations are made of are published in the Journal of Forensic Economics. In addition to that, other studies are put forth. The association provides conferences for its members, which means additional learning opportunities, explanations, a membership directory for people to reach out when you have questions. There are a number of benefits to the membership in NAFE, if nothing more than the Journal of Forensic Economics and the studies and the articles that are published there, as well as book reviews, to provide you the insight that you need to successfully practice forensic personal damages, and for that matter, defend your argument and your understanding of this activity. If nothing else, it's an art as much as it is a science. A second association is the American Academy of Economic Financial Experts. They too are highly regarded, and they also publish another journal, which is called the Journal of Legal Economics. It too will also have a number of studies that you should be aware of that are used in the calculation of personal economic damages. These are just two excellent associations. Also holds an annual conference and has a distinguished membership. Two other affiliated or associations to consider that are very active in the arena that we're talking about is the American Rehabilitation Economics Association and the American Board of Vocational Experts. A number of forensic economists have ventured out and are also experts in vocational analysis. These are used in our calculations. Many times we have to have a care plan, and a lot of times these care plans are put together by a vocational expert. Thinking of personal injury cases, what's that vocation? What does that take to get that person back into a productive or somewhat productive position within the economy? What are the costs? So these are all good sources, all good associations. I wouldn't say that this is the end of the list, but at least it gives you a good starting point. The next thing I have here is that I want to talk about is the practice and application. This is the how of practicing and working within the field of personal economic damages. And I got to be honest with you, this is the part that we journey together, that we have to invest the time in time and resources. We need to know what are the assumptions that we need to make, which studies are we going to use, and why are we choosing that particular study? Why? And once we understand why, then we can defend it. But if we don't know why we're choosing a particular study, we're opening ourselves to a lack of understanding. And these studies are often what we base our assumptions on. The other is informal training. Good example of that is a non-accredited training. You're getting some of that today. You may be getting CPA, but there's no accreditation, no certification in this whatsoever. So you have to learn pretty much on your own. Just as I had said that I had worked in creating my own spreadsheet models on a luggable portable computer when they first came out, creating my own spreadsheets and working tirelessly on doing a new spreadsheet every time I got a new engagement, I got a new case, going with new tables and everything else. The other good possibility in informal training is an association or an affiliation with an experienced forensic economist, helping out, learning the rules of the road, volunteering, somewhat as an apprentice or an understudy, if that's possible. Maybe there's someone in the firm that you're thinking about that already does this work, and they can start you out in terms of the process and their understanding of it. The next is jurisdictional rules, regulations, and influence. This is a great topic. Many questions come up about what do I do here or what do I do there? Why do I do this? And there's not a black and white answer because it's based upon the jurisdiction in which you practice. Certainly, as a so-called expert in this field, you might ask the attorney that engaged you or the party that engaged you, what are the rules and regulations in the court that's going to try this? What is the trier of fact going to expect? What else might I expect as a forensic financial analyst or economist? Well, again, I'd mentioned the wonderful things that go on in terms of the association. Sometimes these are answered. For jurisdictional rules and regulations, I'm looking at my computer in one of my files, and I have a 28-page report on the state of Texas, exactly detailing what the jurisdictional rules, regulations, and influences might be in the courts where I might give testimony on personal economic damages. I think it would be imperative and highly recommended that each of you that are considering personal economic damages or entering into the field of personal economic damages to obtain a copy or some type of document that gives you information, specific information as to the jurisdictional rules of the road for your state, for your community, for your court, whether it be district or federal or state. The last thing I want to talk about on the how is ethics and standards. We're very fortunate in the valuation community that two things happen. One, we belong to professional associations, and each of those professional associations has strong standards. We have a code of ethics. We have standards and protocol that we follow in doing our calculations and valuations of business, whether it be a calculation of value or a conclusion of value or an opinion of value, depending upon the profession of which association that you belong to. But let's talk about the field of forensic economics. The professional ethics are voluntary for anyone who belongs to the association, such as NAFI. One promises to adhere to the professional ethics standards of that association. But there's always the case of differences of opinion. There have been articles and surveys even in the community of what is most frustrating to testifying forensic economists. And their frustrations are not unlike valuations. There appears to be advocates in the marketplace that act as an advocate for their client. We are not in the field of practicing law. We are in the field of giving information to the trier of fact in personal economic damages. But even the forensic economists find themselves quite often with an advocate on the other side of the table in personal economic damages. How do they do this? Well, it depends on what study they may use. One person may know that of a study that provides an edge, if you will, or an advantage to the client. or the defendant or the plaintiff, whichever it is. So by manipulating and choosing studies, they can give an edge to the plaintiff or to the defendant in a given case. So we try to do this much as objective as possible, but just remember there is no set professional ethics, if you will, or standards that are mandatory that can be called on. The personal deals I've also thrown in, there's personal ethics and standards. You know, sometimes it's always good for a little war story. So I mentioned that I looked at myself as a first generation forensic economist. I did this for 3.5 years on a very active basis, and I would say very successful at the time. However, there came a turning point in which one of the attorneys that I worked for approached me shortly after a trial that we were successful in, and began to ask about the work life or the work that household services that the individual that I had done the calculation on. He began to tell me the little bit that he thought we could gross up the economic damages from the perception of household services. He further went on to tell me that he just read a study and come across an out of Houston, Texas. And at the end, what he was basically saying was 1 and 1 equal 3. And I thought about that for the moment, of how all these hours that could be applied to the household services that this individual was rendering could be possible. I kept reflecting personally that my dad was on 24-hour call as an executive at then General Dynamics, now Lockheed Martin. And I could attest to the hours that he put in work, plus the times that he would take calls that would be very crucial. But while he may have been on 24-hour call, he was basically paid a salary, which represented, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. He wasn't being paid while he slept, in my opinion. I think there were so many hours. So ethically, this did not appeal to me, and I withdrew, for the most part, of the active practice of personal economic damages at that time. I would say now that we had court reform, a lot of this has changed since then. I don't see that as often, but I think one has to be aware of it. One has to have a comfort factor. So I think that's really important in practicing personal economic damages or any other case, whether it be business valuation. One has to really consider not only their professional ethics and standards, but also their personal ethics and standards. This brings us around to the question and the introduction of damages advocate from Value Source. Colin, would you like to take a break?
I think we could certainly take a break. Should we take a...
Maybe during that I could look at some questions while they, if the attendees want to take a break, we can take a quick break. I can look at some questions, maybe answer some questions, or we can move right on.
Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll come back, let's say, in 10 minutes. How does that sound? So right at the top of the hour. We'll start right back up. You can just leave this on, and you'll be right back. Sound good?
Sounds great to me.
Okay. Tell you what, one thing we could do while we're kind of waiting is you could take a look at some of the questions that have come in and maybe look at some that you might want to answer. So as an example, the first question that comes up here is earning capacity or expected earnings. Another one is, do you distinguish between earnings capacity and likely earnings? So pretty much the same thing. And then I don't know if you want to just take a look at those while people are coming back here and maybe address some of those. And for those who are struggling to find the links, they are there. And the information was on the email as far as how to log in. But if you're not seeing them for whatever reason, we are going to be posting this to the NACFA.com/COVID-19 page, where we have all of our COVID free webinars that have been that have taken place, and we will post the materials there if that would be helpful for you. So
You want me to answer these live, or do you want me to just text in, or what do you want to do, Colin?
Tell you what. So, I mean, maybe we shouldn't have done a 10-minute. A 10-minute almost seems too long. We've had people complain that we should have more breaks, but seems like a long break to me. But I think
we should have more breaks.
No, I would actually rather plow through it and get it done myself. But that's probably how I would do it. Tell you what, for those who are still listening or paying attention, we probably have some who stepped away to go to the bathroom or something. But if you want to just maybe take a second and start maybe just going through them and answering them while people are coming back, that's probably a good idea.
You mean you want me to type the answer, or you want me to answer them live?
Yeah, just answer it live.
I'll do my best.
And if there's something, if you want, if it's not something you want to answer at this time, you could go ahead and just you can dismiss it. Or you can, when I hear you answer it, I'll go ahead and get rid of it so it disappears, so it won't be in our way. How's that?
Okay. Let me see what I can do. I've got a first question here by Mark Weinstein. The question was earnings capacity or expected earnings. Well, the earnings capacity is what that individual will be able to make. So maybe the answer is both. If not, I'll probably need to get back with you on that. But the expected earnings, thinking in what's the forecast period of the expected earnings of the individual, that is, had the accident or injury not occurred, and in a wrongful death case, you know, in a wrongful death case, what were the earnings would have been had not the accident occurred, and what might we expect, or in a wrongful death, what would the expectations of the earnings be had not the earnings attack? In other words, you know, is there a difference between what we forecast the earnings had not the accident happened versus when the accident had happened to that individual? So I'm not too sure there that I've answered that with a lot of articulation, so I apologize for that. Stephen asked, do you distinguish between earnings capacity and likely earnings? I think that's the same question. What are my likely earnings? And I'm not really too sure of that, but I think what my likely earnings are, what can I distinguish between whatever my capacity is or what I'm thinking that I'm making as an individual at the date of an accident or injury. What was I making and what am I going to forecast that out to be? those are going to be my likely earnings based upon some of the studies that I talked about and the assumptions that we're talking about, such as the work-life expectancy. And I'm going to get into that work-life expectancy a little bit later. Probably talked about a little bit about the studies and the difference of some of the studies as I understand it. So I think we pretty much fixed that one. What interest rate are you using for a present value calculation? And like a lot of things, it all depends. What's the date of the injury and the engagement? Because the interest rates and the rates that I might choose can vary based on dates. Am I going to use a historical rate, or am I going to use a current rate? Is it going to be a 20-year rate or 30-year rate? Is it going to be a tiered rate or a laddered rate? Is it going to be before tax, after tax? What's the jurisdiction where I'm practicing? That's going to determine what interest rate that I'm going to use for it as a present value calculation. Non-abstendus, we've restricted using work-life expectancy in certain settings. Where'd it go? That have been adjusted for educate. Are we restricted? Again, that's jurisdictional. You'll have to look in the jurisdiction whether you're restricted from thinking about gender, race, or educational attainment. Good question. What jurisdiction is data from? What jurisdiction? I can't understand what that question is from Andrew. What jurisdiction is data from? The data that you're looking at in the case that we're looking at is from Texas. It's my understanding the choice of discount rate is a choice you'll need to live with the rest of your life. Can you outline the options you have and view the pros and cons? Again, this will take some research and study on your part to understand what discount rate is your choice, what you believe that is. Again, I emphasize the importance of looking at some of the studies, looking at what the current thought process might be. Again, that's information that you get from great information from NAFI as an association. We're taking the time to read the studies and keeping up with the studies and the literature in forensic economics. With COVID-19, wrongful dismissal claims may go through the roof. I agree. I believe that we're going to have a number of problems and opportunities come back with COVID in the area of wrongful termination. Good point. Gerald Lamar wants to know whether Gerald Martin has fixed his model. Early in his career, I used his mode and had to fix some calculations. That's correct. I think Mr. Martin is retired. I haven't seen that study in some time. It's still out there. There are other studies being used presently. So I suspect that we probably need to look at other studies other than Gerald Martin's study at that point in time. We've had some other ones come out. So again, keeping up with the studies and abreast of the field is very important. James asks, has there been any update to the Markov model work-life table since 2011, Journal of Forensic Economics by Scoot and Secca and Kruger? The answer to that is yes, there has been an update. There was an update in 2017, and perhaps one of them, 2019, was an addendum, if I'm not wrong. Again, I refer you to the studies. I'll do a little bit of research, get updated on that. And am I concerned about tables are being outdated? I think there's always that possibility. I'm not sure what the total impact would be, but as we get into looking at damages advocate, I'll address that further. Oh, is there a reason you left out peer-reviewed research in the Journal of Forensic Economics and Journal of Economics? No, not at all. I mean, that's where you get some of the best information when these articles are presented you get a lot of volleying back and forth between the experts, people that are deep into the field of economics, in terms of what their feelings are with different studies, but they are reviewed definitely by their peers, and that's why you can actually have different studies all the time and have articles either agreeing or disagreeing with a given study by an economist. That's a great point, Stephen. Appreciate you bringing that up and posing that as a question. Heather, they are listed as personal economic slides in the top right-hand corner after you click on the class. Will you have them down? I think it's already been done. How do you address the situation with a subject as a minor who's not yet entered the workforce? That's a good question, Rodney. That would be a special study, one that's going to take some forecasting, and there's been actually some articles written on how that's done and how one might approach that. Lamar's made a suggestion: earnings capacity equal medical doctor. Earning expectancy is the medical doctor working as a fry cook. That's true. Again, that would go back into personal injury. One can no longer do what they possibly would do, and the mitigation would be, what are the earnings expectancy after post-injury. How do you determine expected earnings for a person who's currently in educational program, grad school, law school, etc., and has no past earnings? A good question also. That is the forecast, and that is where you get in the points of litigation. That is where you get in a complex case of forensic economics, and you forecast out the best you can what that individual might be. As to your point, what level of education do they have? Were they in grad school? Were they in law school? When they were in law school, I guess you expect that they would pass the bar and go on and be an attorney. What might those earnings look like over the life of a lawyer? If they were in grad school, what were they majoring in? What field of study did we understand that they were going into? Good question, Carol. And finally, hello, Alan. Kim projected, we're going to take a couple more, then we're going to get on so I don't hold you up. But Kim projected lifetime earnings be determined to a reasonable degree of professional certainty. How can we be so certain? What kind of support do you use to provide a foundation for such an opinion? Please provide examples for our guidance. Gee, Alan, that's a really tough question. What's the level of professional certainty? Go back to a given standards, ethics, and studies. The best information that we have, more likely than not, based upon certain statistical studies, that the best that we have to use. What level is, like in business valuation, what level of precision? I think we can only attempt to do our calculations based on solid assumptions, reasonable diligence, and the information that we have. At the end, it's going to determine whether or not we have provided the necessary information and support of our position to the trier of fact. I don't know if that completely answers your question. Rodney has another question here, and I think let's see if we can go ahead and get into the demonstration. And maybe some of these questions will be answered, or we'll be answering all day, because again, we're both in a learning cycle here. So I think that we will attempt to move forward, and maybe I can get a few more of these. Okay. Coming back in, I've done this introduction of Damages Advocate on a number of times. And today we're going to do something a little different. I told you we're going to plow new ground, and we're both going to learn from each other today. So we're going to do a live presentation instead of a PowerPoint. And I hope this may give you a little more incentive, a little more insight of what Damages Advocate is, what it does, what it can be, and how it can be improved. So let's take a look at Damages Advocate. Well, first of all, let me just when we talk about Damages Advocate, what you're going to learn today is you're going to learn what it's a product that is produced by ValueSource. You're going to know what it is, why you might consider using it, and how it works. And we're going to give a full demonstration on how it works today. So by definition, what Damages Advocate really is, it's a web-based suite of economic damages calculation software. And I can tell you that attorneys, valuators, and expert witnesses covering personal injury, wrongful death, and employment law use. Because I speak with them on a frequent basis as part of my contract role with ValueSource. I think what I like about it is that and I want to emphasize this before we get into it, it provides a transparent and fundamental economic damage model. It creates a basic formatted professional report. But that being said, it does not take away the necessity for each of us to understand completely assumptions, economic foundations, and the studies that I alluded to, so that we understand why we're doing something and why we have taken one approach as opposed to another approach. When it creates a basic formatted report, this would be equivalent to what you might provide your client. It is not meant to be an end-all report, but it gives a basic report that is as good as some, maybe less than others, depending upon the amount of detail one wants to put out and present. Different people have different opinions as to what that report ought to be, what that content ought, and how they want to handle it, and to what degree of detail they wish to go in. So we'll take a look at that and talk about it. So there's certain benefits. This is the paid part of this for a promotional part for ValueSource. So let's talk about some of the benefits that you might want to consider for Damages Advocate. It's a way to save time and money. There's some pre-formatted entry forms. There's some built-in data tables. It has pre-built calculation spreadsheets. It'll automatically generate a report, and it's easy enough for staff members to use. Now let's make this perfectly clear. There's two parts of the Damages Advocate application. It's not a black box. It's Excel based. So that makes it transparent. When we go through Damages Advocate, all we have is an overlay to enter data. We're actually entering the data into a Excel workbook. That Excel workbook at the end is linked to a Microsoft Word document, which can be created to create your report. And you will see that today, as well as a PDF version of that report, as well as your ability to export the Excel workbook to see the calculations. So I think that's very important so you understand what we're looking at in a pre-formatted entry forms in the data tables. The last point is I had this question come up by a phone call this morning, I believe, or yesterday morning, and that was easy enough for staff members to use. Consider that anybody that's being involved in personal economic damages. Think of a personal injury attorney who has a knowledgeable paralegal. They've probably seen more data come in on a plaintiff than anyone can imagine, because they intake the data, they have data information filled out, they have the W-2s, they have the earnings history. They probably, much like a marital law paralegal, they have probably spoken more with the plaintiffs than perhaps even the attorney in developing the background information. If properly trained, that paralegal could probably go through and complete on a jurisdictional basis the application and their damages advocate. That's not to say that they would have to do the studies, but they would have some knowledge of the studies, at least just to get a calculation or a starting point. It's easy to simplify the calculation process. There's no creation or maintenance of spreadsheets. Again, you're not like me when I first started out in this, in which I had to create a new spreadsheet and a new workbook for every client that came through. I have a place to store my data. I have a sample. I can create sample and fast creation of master cases based upon my jurisdiction and the type of work that I'm doing. And I can have simple and fast creation of what is cases. In other words, I can change a case and change an assumption, change a study, and see what happens. So I have a number of abilities to quickly make changes and see what that impact might be. I also mentioned I have a calculation process. More on that later. I gain a level of reliability. This program was initially created by a forensic economist. It was purchased and taken over by ValueSource. It's been tested by ValueSource, expert witnesses, attorneys, and other users. It's in a constant state of evolvement. And we're going to be making a number of changes and updates to the program than what you'll see today. We have an annual addition of new databases as they become available, either to ValueSource or become available to the public. And all of the data that you put in your work is encrypted as part of the file storage. And the product's been in use and evolving over 20 years. So it has pretty much a good history with respect to calculating economic damages. I wouldn't necessarily say that it can always do all the complex cases, because a lot of complex cases require a lot of other assumptions and perhaps derivations from the basics of damage advocate. So let's talk about how damages advocate works. So if you will bear with me for a few moments, we are going to go live, and I'm going to attempt to take you of a trial run of damages advocate and how it would work with you. So, as a subscriber to Damages Advocate, you will first put in your username. You will type in your password. You will do a secure login. and you bring up applications to choose from. In this case today, we're going to be dealing with a wrongful death case. And we're going to be dealing with the individual here is Sherry Smith. We're going to open up this case. In a normal case, we would actually just go and start a new case, and by clicking new on this tab, and we will put the case name in. And I'm going to stop here just a moment before we get started. And I want to call your attention to the header right above me where it says home. We're now at the home button, current case none, but you'll notice that 1 through 8, case setup, retirement, lifespan, employment, I mention a process. Well, what's really great about damages advocate, regardless of whether I choose personal injury, wrongful death, or employment law, I have a familiar process that I'm going through. So what I'm suggesting is, if you enter this field and take it seriously, that a lot of these things are going to be the same. All you have to do is apply the correct information between the difference in the cases and understanding the study. So invest the time into the resources, and the rest will be relatively easy. So going to Sherry Smith, we'll click this and we'll hit open. This will bring us to the case setup. And I'll go relatively fast through this because this is in the information that has been provided to you. So we can talk about some of the questions that you might have, and maybe I will be able to answer them. But I hope to do my best to let you know about the strengths and weaknesses here. But here with the first tab that we have is a tab setup and case setup. We have the individual decedent's name. First, last, we have a gender, which is a toggle or drop down window. We put in the birth date of the individual. Whether or not the individual was married, in this case Sherry Smith was not married, we have an option. We're doing wrongful death. We need to deduct the personal consumption, and so we've taken that option. You'll notice over here we put the date of death of the individual, and we have calculated a decimal equivalent of what that decedent's age. We put in the estimated trial or settlement date, and that gives us also the decedent's age as a mark for the calculation. Next tab is personal consumption. We talked about the consumption studies. Here we decided to apply an income study. And in the income study, we've chosen, and if we don't choose the income study, we've got income at 100%, and we have to choose whether or not we want to look at a consumption rate. So here we're going to apply an income study. And in this particular one, we've chosen the study, Earl Sheet study. There's 3 more studies down here, Martin Average, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Earl Sheet. Now, what's interesting in this particular case is I mentioned knowing the studies. At this date that we're actually doing, this study would not be normally chosen. If I was doing the study today, this would not be a study that I've chosen. This study has been known to be unreliable. But in this particular study, we have another reason why we're choosing it, and that's we're comparing this particular analysis against or compared to a PhD economist who had done his own study for this particular wrongful death case. So we're just comparing apples and apples, but for the point is, when I tell you the importance of knowing your studies, this is not a study that I would use. At one time this study was used, it was a survey study. It's determined not necessarily considered reliable, by the majority of the forensic economists. How do I know that? Because of the information of reading in the NAFI journal. So there's articles, and also I know by articles that are written and been published of what forensic economists are currently doing today. What is their current thought process? What is their current thought process on the current studies that are available to be used? And what do they have the most confidence in? So we get into, we've got this, and then we move into administration. This is pretty simple. We know what the defendant was, Big Tex Transit Bus Company. We put in the valuation analyst or economist's name and information. Here I put in my information, and we complete this and go to the next step. In the next step, we're gonna enter data and make decisions about the retirement and the life span of the decedent. This goes back to a question. We have a drop-down window. The first one under the decedent. What was the race? Well, in this case, this individual was black. But we have the options for other ethnic groups. If we are in a jurisdiction that would not allow us to put any information in with respect to race, we could put not applied. But in this case, we were able to do this, and there's jurisdiction, it's allowed, and this will go in, and this will be part of, it will go into and be a consideration within the tables to figure out what this individual's work-life expectancy is and their mortality table. I don't think it's necessary to go into some of the thought process that we know that even in mortality and lifespan, that ethnic groups differ between each other in terms of mortality, life, and health, and other factors. So that being said, we'll go into looking at the work-life expectancy. At the date of this particular calculation, the work-life expectancy table that was being used was a Kruger-Skugin-Checkham model. Again, there are a number of tables here. Need to be familiar with those, but at a drop-down window, you choose which study you would choose in work-life expectancy. Again, as I mentioned, damages advocate is going to be updated, and very soon with some additional tables that will be newer and a little more current than some of these tables. As more tables become private as opposed to public. The employment status, we have another options here, as you can see. This individual was working full-time. The last education the person had was high school diploma. What you should be thinking as we go through this, why do I need the information? Why are we asking all of these things? It all goes back to the tables that we're looking at. These all are variables that are considered in determining these values here, such as work-life expectancy, retirement age, expected age at retirement, or sometimes the term is exiting the workforce, projected retirement date. What's the life expectancy? Here we're going to use at the date of this particular date of death, we're going to use the 2000 CDC, Center for Disease Control tables. But as you know, these tables are updated all the time. The latest table was published in 2019. This gives us a expected life expectancy of 39.46 years. And we've completed that. What other options do we have? This person, as you remember, was not married. So spouse is grayed out. We look at the options. What's the reference date that we're using for as ages? The injury date, which brings forward what that we have, which was taken from our first case setup. select the for reference date, we're going to use actual age, such as the injury date, just so you see these reference dates. There was no spouse, was not applicable. We'll go to the next. We're going to talk about the employment of the individual. What do we know about the projected employment for the decedent? So we click on this, and just so you see the entry forms, we have general data. We do a quick entry. What was the title of the individual? This person was a medication aide, and she worked for the Mother Rest of Assisted Living. We know she started at the injury date. We're going to do the calculation at 1/26/2007. The end date will be her retirement date at 9/29/2000. I'm getting tongue-tied at this date and keeping an eye on where we are. What about income? We're going to start by entering her starting salary. In this particular case, but we have some options just so you see them. Starting salary, historic income, paycheck, monthly rate, daily rate, or even the occupational earnings data from the U.S. government. We didn't have that, and we put in an annual income. Moving over to the next tab, we have benefits. We talked about earlier, talked about the importance of understanding benefits. Here's what we consider benefits. This particular method, we're using the select benefits from Bureau of Labor Statistics. There is also an exterior study called calculate percentage from dollar value, or enter percentage of salary. But we're going to use the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Which date are we going to choose? Based upon the date of injury, we're using the 2011. And as you can see that these are also updated. We're going to use a particular table within that study. And we are using the private industry, healthcare, and social services. If you went out to the internet, you'd be able to find this table. And the data item we're using is nursing and residential care facilities. What benefits are we choosing? Well, I could use all the total benefits and everything would be checked. Or in this case, what did this individual actually have? And we had legally required benefits, we had insurance supplemental pay, and we had paid leave. So those are the only benefits that we're considering in this particular calculation. How are we going to grow the earnings? We could just apply an industry. Here in this case, we're using a pre-trial growth rate of 2.67 and a post-trial growth rate of 2.67. Or had we wanted to, we could have actually applied an industry rate from Bureau of Labor Statistics and used education and health services. But in this case, the calculation was made based on a manual entry of a pre-trial growth rate of 2.67 and a post-trial growth rate of 2.67. Once we've done that, we've hit OK, and we've done the projected employment for the decedent. There is no projected employment for a spouse since she was unmarried, so we'll look to dependents. This is part of our loss calculation. When we look at dependents, there's a loss here to the estate. In this case, Sherry Smith had a daughter who was 30 years old. Into care was in 2008. We can edit just so you understand how that works. We can take a look at it. The child birth date was 2/14/1990. Current age was 30/32 at the date of death. Dates of care. Care starts at birth. Age of care ends at 18. End of care 2008. But for dependents that you could have this, you could have cases that you have dependents that are relied upon the decedent in this case, or an injured party, and because of those services that are being provided, we need to consider what that economic damage needs to be added to our damage calculation to get total damages. We hit OK, and we've covered the dependent coverages of Gloria Smith. Let's take a look at household services. Again, we're following the same process map we would in any calculation. Here we're looking at the decedent. We have certain types of event. We have a damages date, a trial settlement date, and a retirement date for this individual for household services. We'll take a look at the editing in terms of the end. We, and damages advocate, we're going to look at events that are major, and there are certain types of events that we would step through, such as a major starting a job, ending a job, start care, ending care. Sometimes you're looking at multiple jobs, but in this case for household services, we're looking at the event being a major. It's a damages date. The individual lost her life on 1/26/2007. The calculation method we're going to use for household service is a manual calculation. I mentioned before, sometimes you have a study that we could use. Sometimes there's no services performed. We ignore that. But I point out this. There is an outside service that has been used before called dollar value of a day. It seems to be very popular. This would be an outside subscription that could be used in Damages Advocate. It will be manually applied. You would use the DVD data and put your own information in from that DVD data right here in the calculation. Interesting thing about dollar value of a day is that I've got friends that swear by it and use it all the time. There's others that never use it at all. And others will get in and look at the household service function and say, I want to take a look at that, and I want to put that information in manually. And there's some other questions about manually. Here we got dependent care. This individual was a child, but we got services, general housework, of $26.5 hours a week for household services. It's $7.49 an hour. So we get a full calculation here of the dependent care and a rate per hour on these services that this individual is putting forth. In my readings, I find it very interesting that among the studies, in terms of knowledge, there seems to be a disagreement about where do we get the rate. Would this be the rate? Would be minimum wage. Another person would call it an agency rate. What if I went out and I had to hire an individual from a temp service? Do I pay that that value along with the overhanging agency fee on top of the hourly rate? Think of a maid service. So do I use the agency rate, or do I use the individual hourly rate that I might contract a maid with to do household services or dependent care? Think of the agencies that take care of a dependent. So, you know, there's more than meets the eye here in terms of questions about what rate. Remember, I also mentioned that certain people might disagree on how they do it. Could you increase the damages just by a study or an assumption? Sure, you could. think about if the assumption was simply, do I use the actual contract rate for the individual for household services, or do I use the agency rate? What do you think the override of the agency would be? How would that increase the damages? What would be the proper rate? So these are considerations that I think that one needs to make. They need to reconcile their mind before they jump off and just start pushing buttons and make calculations. So these are all good thoughts and probably beyond the scope of what we're doing today. So let's move on. So the next thing that we have is medical expenses. In this case, the decedent had no medical expenses. I hate to say it, this person was dead on arrival. The ambulance, there were no further medical expenses. Perhaps we could have put some other damage expenses out. So since we didn't have that, we could go into other damages that the individual consumed. In this particular case, there were no other damages. Had there been some, we could have added these other damages just by the add, and these would be the one-time up charges. Remember, we mentioned property damages and other things within the jurisdiction that might be included in a wrongful death case. In a personal injury case, we have lots of things that we might consider. We might consider repairing a wrecked car if there was a car accident. We might consider ongoing medical expenses in number 6. We might think about care plan and other damages. So we have got a lot of different options in a personal injury. Actually, a personal injury case perhaps might be considered more complex than a wrongful death case. But finally, when we come back to the next calculation, we reach the calculation options that we have to determine. How are we going to grow household services? In this case, in this particular case, we've chosen to apply the Bureau of Labor Statistics growth rate to household services. By clicking it on, we've got a post-trial growth rate and the post-trial growth rate. But in this case, between the pre-trial growth rate, by applying Bureau of Labor Statistics, I overrode the 267 and used the Bureau of Statistics average growth rate for that occupation from the date of injury to the date of trial. Interest and discount rates. We have a pre-trial interest rate and we have a post-trial discount rate. The question was earlier, what rate am I currently using? Can I live with it? Yeah, I can live with it, but it's all going to depend upon the date of the valuation. In this particular case, this valuation, we used a pre-trial interest rate of 2.67 and a post-trial discount rate of 4.5. 4.5% would probably be considered a nominal rate. It includes both inflation and growth. One has to determine, again, jurisdiction, what's going to be the most appropriate rate to use. Am I going to consider the rate on a 20-year bond? What's the length of time between now and the expected date of death? Would I use a long-term risk-free treasury bill, or perhaps I'm going to use a historical rate, or perhaps I'm going to use a tiered rate or a stepped rate? So these are all considerations for your studies and determination of how you want to determine your post-trial discount rate, how you feel that you can defend it, how you can explain it, and how it's going to help the trier of fact. How am I going to grow it? Again, I've got a Bureau of Labor Statistics growth, and again, you'll notice that it's a nominal rate, meaning that includes the nominal rate, that growth rate includes both inflation and growth or productivity. Might make a comment about Bureau of Labor Statistics. Most of us understand consumer price index. We also understand that a lot of growth in a job is not necessarily true productivity, but it's the inflation rate. that goes into it, not productivity, but inflation. And how often is that growth rate calculated? Usually it's on a lag. Not everybody gets a cost of living rate increase every year. It's usually on a lag of 2 to 3 years. So that being considered, think about how that impacts your rate. Think about, again, under COVID-19, if you were doing a calculation today, what rate would you be using? Would it be, would you have to make an adjustment for you? I'm sure that a lot of people on this call today and on this webinar today have been through a couple of the other COVID-19 webinars talking about our interest rates, how we're going to expect them, what kind of adjustments we're going to make with them. You've heard all the experts and pontificate exactly what they would do that rate. The question really comes down to, what are you going to do about the rate in a personal economic damage calculation? And how are you going to explain it? How are you going to reconcile it and defend it? Again, we're going to do a present value calculation. Here I'm using simple interest rate. My discount method is going to be annual, and I'm using a federal effective tax rate of 8% for this individual, and I am adjusting the earnings for income taxes. Again, I suggest you look at the jurisdiction of that. You could take your report text to be net of inflation, which is a constant dollar method. At one time that was very popular, but not so much today is my understanding. Once we've made all of these calculations, it's time to take a look at the results. And this is the final part of Damages Advocate. You have a choice of downloading a Microsoft Word document or an Adobe. They're both exactly the same, but here you can actually create a report. What we need to do is do two things. We're going to go back and download a report first that you can see the report. Opens up Microsoft Word. And now you have a wrongful death economic damage report for Sherry Smith. Your name, your firm. You've got a table of contents already formatted for you. It's about an 8-page report. Case overview gives you the pertinent facts. What are your assumptions that you put forward on this calculation? Information about the decedent. And this is all in your materials today, so you've got a copy of this. Talks about the work-life expectancy, what you calculated it on, life expectancy, what tables, where they came from. It gives you a summary, gives you the future values of the total loss. Damages were $1.3 million. We bring them to present value, and those present value on this individual was $600,287. It gives you a summary of the projected employment for the decedent, the pre-trial income, the post-trial income, tables. So you can go through that and take a look at that. Talks about lost production of household services, explanation of the calculation method. I'll just kind of go through this real quick. It gives you some data citations, where things came from, work-life expectancy, fringe benefits, personal income, consumption, pre-trial. These are all selected by your assumptions in the drop-down windows that we looked at. A little more about what we've got, a little more background, and that's your 8-page report. The question always comes up, well, is this report acceptable? Sometimes it's acceptable. Sometimes people want to put a little more information. Some people want to put a little less information in this report. Depends on what level of detail you're comfortable with and what needs to be done for your client and your attorney, your expectations. Certain people put all the tables out and put all the information out there. Again, this is not an end all. You may want to do some wordsmithing. You may want to expand this report. You may want to subtract this report, but you have the information there. So that's what the report looks like. You have a copy in your materials today. So let's just minimize this and let's go back to the Excel workbook. Again, I mentioned that this is transparent. So we'll now open up the workbook. It's Excel. And now we've got the Excel workbook where everyone can see. And when we look at the workbook, it comes up to the summary page. This again shows the information that we had in the report. And this gives a good example of how Excel is linked to Microsoft Word to create the report from the workbook. This is the same schedule that you had seen embedded into the report in Microsoft Word. But along the bottom, you have lots of tabs that show how the calculations were made, such as the medical expenses, and it's talking about where the provider was. It's more of a lot of questions within the spreadsheet, but what you're going to be concerned more with such as this: how are the earnings calculated, information, the inputs that you used, and we used to look at the date, the consumption inputs that we had in Damages Advocate. You know, we've got quite a bit here as far as the spreadsheet goes, which, you know, we can take a look at, and at some later date, if you want to take another tour of Damages Advocate, I'm sure that Value Source myself would be more than happy to do that. We've got services, post-trial services that we talked about. It's all here in the tabbed in the workbook. We've got expenses that we're looking at to go through: pre-trial expenses, post-trial expenses, the growth assumptions. Here's the Bureau of Labor Statistics chart and table, the ones that we've used, which was the nominal case. And we've got the consumption tables that we've had, and we've got another groups of tables about what the individual was and did. So in summary, this is the export from Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel that we brought into the table. And that is to the end of Damages Advocate. Like I said, it's always in a working process. It's being updated. We Value Source expect to make a number of changes to Damages Advocate in terms of updating tables. We always rely on all the users that are users of Damages Advocate for suggestions and improvements. There are a lot of tables out there, by the way, that we didn't really get into in the scope of this particular webinar. But there are tables, even though maybe peer reviewed, that are somewhat controversial. And those tables may or may not be used because sometimes they have brought up questions, and they are tables that certain attorneys perhaps have asked people to use. And when we talked about peer review and the question and answer, a lot of things have been peer reviewed, and those particular studies have been pretty much discounted because of problems within it. And for instance, one that's been asked time in, time out that I'm not going to really go into, it's when it reached the federal level, it's only succeeded perhaps 15% of the time. But we had a user ask why Damages Advocate did not consider that table or put that into the calculation. And after my research looked at it, you know, if it only had a success factor of 15% at the federal level, it's probably not a table that I particularly want to use. So that's a consideration of when we go into looking at this part of the webinar. I forgot one thing that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Colin.
I was just going to say, do you want it? We're kind of running out of time, but do you want to take some questions? There's a bunch in the question Q&A.
Yeah, I'll be happy to see what I can do, and maybe I can hum a few bars. So let's just do it that way. Let me go back to let me find out where I was here at the moment, because we're into it. So let's see what we got. Questions. We got 15. Rodney asked if a 25-year-old person is the subject of wrongful death. As an economist, how can you identify who is the rightful individuals who have been harmed by the death, absent the hedonic aspects? You know, it's a really good question. I think that the answer to that question, outside of the hedonic aspect, I think that the attorney is going to determine who is the subject of that. So. Kevin asked, how do you provide an opinion as to the future medical expense, or do you rely on medical expert, life care planner? That's a great question, Kevin. If I had future medical expenses and I knew in the data intake that I was going to have future medical expenses, then I would put those in the other expenses and damages advocate. Not having those information and not wanting to make some broad assumption, if we're going to have future medical expenses, and I'm thinking we're talking personal injury, most definitely would expect the attorney at least to exert the time for a life care planner to project that. I would want to put my projections based upon that expert. I don't think that as a valuation analyst, forensic financial analyst, I'm in the position to really forecast out what those medical experts are. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not examining the defendant. I'm only taking what information has been given to me, and I want the best possible source because I'm going to rely on that source. I'm not going to rely on myself to make that. Opinion is void of material error equal reasonable certainty. Okay, got it, Daniel. I think that's. Can we use George Floyd as a case example where economic loss may not highlight the magnitude of the damages given the circumstances? I'm not really sure what we're talking about, where those economic losses might be. We do have a wrongful death in the case of George Floyd, very probably such an unforgettable and unnecessary loss of life. But at the end of the day, from a forensic financial analyst, what have we just been going over? If we had the information, do I know with the medical history George Floyd had not the injury occurred, the wrongful death? What are we actually asking here? What was that individual? That individual was employed. I know he was employed as a nightclub. What else did George Floyd do? We know certain personal data around him. What was his earnings history? What was his capacity of earnings? What was it been his expected earnings had not the death occurred? We have all the data there, but I'm not exactly sure if it's a special example of economic loss may not highlight the magnitude of the damages given the circumstances. If you're talking about punitive damage, we've already addressed that. That's not what a forensic financial analyst does, or at least this one does not, nor are we addressing any type of hedonic damages as well. Can this be applied to commercial or agricultural litigation? If we're referring to damages advocate, I would not say so. I would not try to apply the the software for that application. However, I do know a couple of individuals have used it for other applications. I wouldn't, in my opinion. Can you print out the selected SCOOG tables from your work papers? That's a good question. I'd have to look back at the SCOOG tables to actually see whether they're complete in there. If not, again, that would be a table that you would want to research and print out and have your file. Earnings rate selected under the employment tab. Is this a nominal growth rate? I think we've already answered that in terms of the choice of whether we do or don't. Your example used data that is post-dated, the date of death, and the date of trial by several years. Does that pose a risk of your data not being consistent with the facts issue? I think that may, Rodney, that may be a good question, but I'm not sure. Think about if I understand your question correctly, think about the publication date. What was known or knowable? In valuation, we have to say what's known or knowable. I'm not going to use data that was not, I'm not going to use data in a case, in this particular case, that was not published. It might have been available at the date I was doing the calculation, but it wasn't published at the date of the injury. I'm not going to use it. And I don't think it affects, I think it's consistent. How does the spouse affect the damage calculation for wrongful death? Certain maintenance issues. There's certain economic factors there. Again, I think we kind of went through that in Damages Advocate by looking at that information. I know we're running out of time, so let me see what we're doing. We'll go just a little further. What advantages do we have in providing these services versus economics and PhD? I'll try to answer that question the best that I possibly can. At the time that I was hired, the reason the attorneys wanted a finance guy, an MBA, as opposed to the economists they were using is because when the economists got on a witness stand or in a deposition, they were not explaining and articulating the facts and the explanations of present value to the level that a normal juror could understand. So that was a very big plus in that case. And I had a number of jurors say that. That has come up into surveys as well, some of the NAFI surveys, that an economist, as bright as they are, sometimes forget themselves in terms of how much knowledge they possess, and they cannot articulate that and at the level of the normal juror that they're trying to provide the information for. Frank wants to know the latest DVD issue in the program is 2011. The 18 issue is currently available. That is correct. That, again, I mentioned, that is something that we cannot put in the Damages Advocate program any longer unless the author wanted to allow us and hasn't got back. So therefore, it behooves an individual that wants to use dollar value of a day or feels the necessity of it to make that individual subscription. How old is this software and how much has it been tested in courts? Been used for some 20 years and there's a number of people using it. I think we've already answered that as well. Any suggestion for marketing these services to attorneys? No, it just depends on whether the attorney wants to have a quick calculation to get an idea of where they are, whether they need to hire an expert to go through it. It's a good quick calculation if they understand it. And if an attorney does enough of these cases, they would understand it. When's it appropriate to use a discount? I think we talked about that, real versus constant. Have you ever used real yields on treasury inflated protected securities? That again is some of the studies. Those are some of the articles that have been written in the Journal of Forensic Economics. Good reading to make that decision. Has the software been upheld against the Daubert-Frye challenge? It's very interesting. I would look back to Mark Weinstein, you know, and I might say has your Excel spreadsheet and your Microsoft Word report, has it been upheld against the Daubert-Frye challenge? Has it been peer reviewed? I don't know if either had. Again, this software is not a black box. It's making the same calculations that I'd make all in a workbook. So I think the information is, what are the assumptions that you're making? How did you get there? And how did you get there? I'm not sure that's really a Daubert question, but it's a good question. What about the individual that's doing the testimony? How would this template work with an owner manager loss of income, as a template would need to consider corporate forecast? Andrew, I might have to get back to you, but I've done that on a couple of calculations in which they had business owners in personal injury. Work-life tables are for purchase from NAFI. Yes, they are. NAFI has all of that. Again, good point. I really encourage everybody to become a member of NAFI, one of the other associations, and look to the benefits that they have. How do you handle mitigating earnings in a personal injury case when you don't have a report from a vocational analyst? In a personal injury case, I guess you're saying, okay, the individual, I would have to have a vocational analyst, that individual working. Most personal injury cases that I've had, the individual has gone back to work at a lesser level of compensation. They wouldn't qualify. Truck drivers working as auto parts salespeople or counter people with minimal hours, etc. So those are the basis for getting the mitigated earnings. Surrounding circumstances are relevant to the economic damage calculation should be based on actual economic damages. I'm not sure about that. Oh yeah, I agree. Kevin Kolaski. Other types of damage, non-economics, or determined by trier or fact. That's correct. How the dollar value of day tables incorporated in damages advocate and calculate. You get the DVD, you've got the table, and you manually input the data from the table into the application. I think that's the answer that you're looking for. And can wrongful dismissal be claimed when the pandemic is global and not restricted to just one country? I think there's more to that. And I don't have the answer. You have to take that up with the attorney, and they're building the case. All we're doing is looking at what the actual damages would be with the trier of fact based upon the facts and precedents. Again, we're not practicing law. We're just making a calculation, assuming the facts are correct. I would throw it back as an analogy for those that have attended a couple of the NHCVA webinars on COVID. The same thing was in the case of business interruption. Can we still try the business interruption cases as a commercial damage? It all depends. You can always try, depending upon the language of the insurance contract was and what the interpretation would be. So I would say the same thing is on personal economic damages. It all depends. So best try. And I think that pretty much gets us through here. We've gone over the hour. I appreciate everybody hanging out. Just let me, you've got the information that you need in terms of report. I've gone through this real quick. What you need to know in this particular deal, the expert report was $610,000. The advocate estimate was 600. It's an acceptable variance. The difference was consumption, table difference, and the time period. Again, James Publishing is also a great resource. There's the old book from Martin and Weinstein, Determining Economic Damages. Some of the trips and tracks that you've got, you got to review the expert calculations. You've got to research and study the databases. You got to look at the outcome variances. You don't need to go off the reservation without facts. And a lot of times the attorneys will lead you this way. We're not in the business of advocacy, but objectivity and credibility. And we keep it simple and articulate the results. I've given you a damages advocate value proposition. It's process driven. It's transparent with Microsoft Office, Excel, and Microsoft Word. We're going to be doing some updating on it, and you got cases that are secure. If you're interested in damages advocate, you might check with your value source, your NAC representative, and get a discount, and talk a little bit further about it. And last but not least, if you have further questions or if I can help you in this field, post-webinar, on damages advocate, feel free to drop me an email at my value source email, jharwellvaluesource.com. They'll get in touch with me. We'll talk. You can also go to my personal business email address, and I'll give that to you later, and as well as a phone number. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I appreciate the time you've taken spending this time with us at the NACVA CTI webinar series. I wish you a great week and just ask you to stay safe out there.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was awesome. Thanks for everybody for hanging around a little bit later. Sorry about that. And everybody have a great afternoon. See you later.